Students, good morning. I, Dr. Sanjana Sharma, welcome you to the class. Students, in our last class of paper 6th, we discussed Victorian era, how Britain appeared, what was the political, social, economical condition of Britain during the reign of Queen Victoria. We discussed all these things in our last class. Today we are going to discuss the main features or characteristics of Victorian poetry. Students, Victorian poets wrote on multiple themes and subjects. That is why Victorian poetry needs to be analyzed by separating the Victorian poets from the pre-Raphaelites. While Tennyson, Browning led Victorian poetry from the front, Dante, Gabriel Rossetti, his sister Christiana Georgina Rossetti, and A.C. Swinburne are said to have been the pioneers of pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. The major difference between these two distinct group of poets is seen in their choice of style and poetry. The pre-Raphaelites stressed on the connection of poetry and painting. Therefore, Victorian poetry differs in form, rhyme, and length from one poet to another. Students, now let us come to the characteristics of Victorian poetry. The first thing that we can observe is that we find a conflict between religion and science. It was a byproduct of the intellectual development of this age. The leading poets of this age reacted to this religious skepticism through their works. Browning attempted to criticize realism through his poems like Fra Lippo Lippi. He also questioned the demands of the church that go against human nature. Similarly, when Tennyson wrote In Memoriam in the year 1850, he raised many questions on life and death. Students, Victorian poetry can be seen as the object of displaying the rural and rustic England. They raised voice of indiscrimination against the commoner masses that had been done due to industrialization. Victorian poets took a stand on social reform. Students, we see that in the preceding era poets, we can find use of imagery vividly. Victorian poets also used imagery and senses to convey the chaos or struggle between religion and science and ideas about nature and romance. Tennyson prominently used the sensory and imagery elements in his poems. One notable example in Tennyson's poem of this thing we can find in the poem Mariana. Students, Victorian poets understood the misery that Industrial Revolution had brought about in British society. And Victorian poetry became object and real due to this, as it displayed the urban life. The poets wrote on isolation, despair, doubt, and general pessimism that surrounded the era. On the surface, Victorians seemed to enjoy the wealth and prosperity, but the feelings of uncertainty, cynicism, and self-doubt was reflected. They were reflected in the poems of this age. The issue of psychological isolation is common in almost all the great poems of Victorian era. Tennyson's Locksley Hall is about the restless young England. Matthew Arnold explored the strange disease of modern life and the loneliness of modern age men in his poem The Scholar Gypsy. In The City of Dreadful Night, Arthur Clarke deals with the note on insomnia and pessimism. Students, the next thing that we can see in Victorian poetry is their interest in medieval fables and legends. The Victorian poets took interest in medieval legends and fables. Just as the Pre-Raphaelites attempted to restore the essence of medieval art in their poems, poets like Tennyson, William Morris, and Swinburne wrote poetry on Arthurian legends of the medieval age. Tennyson's Dials of King Arthur was a series of 4 books that were centered on King Arthur and the Round Table. In his other works, such as Sir Lancelot and Queen Guinevere, Sir Galel, and Mater the Author, Tennyson explored the vision of medieval quests and tales. Swinburne idealized medievalism in his works as the golden age of tragic love and tragic heroism. It is noteworthy that Victorian poets went back to medievalism not as escapist but in order to redirect it to the contemporary developments in politics, literature, and art. Students, the next thing that can be found in Victorian poetry is realism, as it is quite realistic and has less idealized view of nature as compared to the romantic poets who were idealists and believed in art for art's sake. Nature had lost its idealized position, which are more often found in romantic age. In the Tennyson age, nature had become a source of leisure and inspiration for the poets. Another one of the most important characteristic of Victorian poetry is sentimentality. The Victorians wrote about artistic creations, thus giving way to deeper imaginations. Poets like Alfred Tennyson prominently used the element of sentimentality in their poems. One of the chief or the prominent characteristic of this era was the development of dramatic monologue. Students, though the Victorians used medieval settings, forms, and themes, many other forms of poetry also held prominence during the Victorian era. The dramatic monologue became one of the most popular gifts of Victorian poetry to English literature through works such as Alfred Tennyson's Ulysses and Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. Robert Browning popularized dramatic monologue in most of his works such as My Last Duchess, Gawain's Funeral, or The Last Ride Together. These poems were published in Browning's Dramatic Lyrics in 1842. Apart from writing dramatic monologues, the Victorian poets also explored sonnets, epics, elegies, and ballads. So, students, we can see that Victorian poetry is the direct outcome of prevailing socio-economic, political, and literary activities of that time. Thank you very much, student. Our class comes to an end today. Thank you.